all of you, Michelle and Josh, for making this visit possible. Yes, it's joint work with two other economists in Germany, Lena Detlefsen and Tobias Heitland, who are both in Kiel, far up in northern Germany. And as Josh already said, we are a team of economists kind of lurking into demography a little bit with this paper. So far, our reception in demography has been very nice, probably nicer than what demographers get when they work in econ. But basically, what I would be very happy about is feedback from you, mostly demographers or demographic economists. That's basically more what you would like to hear about this topic from us, and I will try to address it. Yes, this topic is titled the fertility. This paper is titled "The Fertility of Refugees in Germany," which I understand is also a major topic in your department at the moment for obvious reasons, due to large inflows of migrants into the United States. And it's probably an under-researched topic in many countries due to the difficulty of collecting appropriate data on the migrant population, in particular in the refugee and irregular migration context. Oh, now it stopped working.
Try now?
Yes. So, kind of a rhetorical question, why do we care about the fertilities of refugees? In the German context, you might remember in 2015-16, we had this big wave of asylum seekers transiting via Turkey, the Balkans, into Germany, more than 1 million asylum seekers, which was more than 1% of our total population. And of course, these asylum seekers and refugees may have a demographic impact beyond their initial arrival, because of course, these are people who are having children and who will continue having children after their arrival in their destination countries. So from a big demographic picture, the immigration of people of childbearing age may, of course, slow down population aging, which we're observing in many high-income aging countries. But at the same time, it also poses challenges to the schooling system, to the childcare system, and to the integration systems, which might be in place or not too much in the receiving countries. And that's why the fertility of refugees is kind of the second-order demographic impact of these large migration streams we are now increasingly observing to the OECD countries, I might say. So a little bit of background. We are borrowing mostly here from literature in sociology. So work done by Il Kulu and my colleague at the BRB, Nadia Milewski, mostly with a focus on migration to Europe from Turkey, for example. So basically some hypothesis, what should we expect with the fertility of arriving migrants to happen after arrival? It could be basically just their fertility patterns from the country of origins persist. There's no assimilation into the host society. Could also be they're very much adapting the fertility to the receiving country. In the shorter time frame, the migration process basically is an interruption of fertility. So should we expect a recuperation of fertility after immigration, or would it be a lifetime deficit? There has been work done with the data we are using by my colleagues Lisa Backhaus and Renaud Sauer in a publication from 2019, who did not look directly at the fertility, but at the family context of these arriving migrants and refugees in Germany. So in this paper, we are looking at the fertility of these refugees within a fixed time window around their arrival in Germany. Given they arrived in 2015-16, we cannot make any long-run tests of these assimilation or persistence hypotheses, but we can provide a first look at the short-run response of fertility of these arriving migrants. The data we are using comes from the German socioeconomic panel. We are pooling samples with different target populations and timeframes. So when we started basically thinking we should know a bit more about our migrant population in Germany, the SEP started collecting these migration samples, which were, however, limited to people who emigrated to Germany up to 2013, and which were drawn on the basis of register information from the employment agency. Then, after we had this large influx in 2015-16, pretty quickly, we responded by collecting refugee-specific samples with the GSERP, organized by a cooperation of the Federal Employment Agency, the Federal Ministry for Migration and Asylum, and the Socioeconomic Panel Infrastructure. This time drawing from the register of the foreigners in Germany, focusing on individuals who arrived between 2013 and 16, and who had applied for asylum or were hosted as part of different protection. For example, Syrians, same as Ukrainians, do typically not have to apply for asylum because they are granted kind of a general protection status, but still they were covered by this. And then there were later refugee samples collected up to 21 so far, which were basically refreshments and enlargements of the previous samples that were being done.
Can you say something about responses? Are people, is this something we're obligated to participate in by law? Does that response rates high, low?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if there was a legal obligation to respond. I would suspect no. And of course, there was attrition, from people going to other destinations later. It was intended as a panel, but that necessitated these refreshments. And of course, during the process of collecting in between the waves, there are more people arriving. So also the size and structure of the refugee population changed over time, which is a challenge to the sample designs. Response rate is a good point that I should know.
Is a birth observed only when in the longitudinal sample, or is it also retrospective?
I'll come to that. So these surveys are, let's say, large for a German perspective, but they're not particularly large. That's why we have to focus on 5 countries of origin, which are the most prominent one. Far above the others is Syria, representing 59% of the observations in our main sample of women, followed by Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Iran. We restrict the cohorts born between 1980 and 1999. So if you think we start observing these people in around 2015, then the oldest women are 35, which is pretty far in the reproductive age of these countries of origin. And the youngest are about 16, 17, so basically at the beginning of their reproductive age. We restrict to individuals who arrived in 2009 or later, and most of the women in our sample arrived in 2015, namely more than 50%. As I said before, one issue is the representativeness of these surveys that has always been an issue in the design. For now, we are not utilizing any weights that are provided with these surveys because we are pooling these different samples together, which were drawn from different populations. Qualitatively, we get very similar results when we use some type of weights that they provide, but we kind of like how the results look like a bit better without the weights, because with the weights, sometimes you get like a weird spike out of nothing. The weighting issue has always been a bit of a problem with these surveys, as I said, because also the populations they are meant to represent changes a lot over time with more migrants coming in, others leaving. A final issue, so undocumented immigrants are not covered by these surveys. As I said, only the ones who are appearing in some federal register. We don't think undocumented migration is a big issue in Germany, just for the reason we discussed yesterday. Nowadays, actually, irregular migrants will try to get registered as soon as possible once they cross the border, because this basically gives them more protection, more access to public goods than staying undocumented, which also lines up with that even if your request for asylum is rejected, which takes a long time, there are several legal rounds basically you go through, the deportation rates of rejected asylum seekers are very low. So what do we know about the fertility of these women? They are surveyed about the years of birth of all of the children who were born before they migrated and the children who migrated since then, and the children who were born since migration. So we can code each year of birth as a birth event. We also know the year they arrived in Germany. We can combine this information and calculate for each birth how many years before or after the arrival of the mother the specific birth has occurred. And currently, because most of the people arrived in 2015, our survey data goes to like 21. We restrict to a window of 5 years around the age, the year of arrival. Still, this is a panel, but it's still a bit unbalanced in the post-arrival years because some women were only surveyed for the first time like in 2017. So they're not in there for the full 5 years that we want to examine them. So on average, the women in our sample are 26 years old when they arrived in Germany. The average birth rate, pooling all these women together in this 5-year window, is nearly 15% across basically this 10 years. How does the fertility look like by the point of their arrival? 38% have not given birth yet. 16% have given birth once. 90% have 2 children. 13 have 3. 8% have 4 children. And 5% have already 5 children or more. We also know the level of education by the time of arrival. A huge share, almost half of them, do only have primary education or not even that. Another nearly 40% have secondary education, 40% have a tertiary education. So how do we analyze these birth events? So we can code this birth event as a binary outcome. Basically, an outcome that switches to 1 if a birth occurs in a pre or post-arrival year. So we are running a very simple probability regression. As the main explanatory variables, we use either the time since arrival, measured in these 5 years around the year of arrival. Alternatively, we can just code a binary post-arrival indicator. We can interact these with the country of origin indicators or with the level of education. And we can always control for the age, the country of origin, and the cohort, which is why also then we cluster standard errors at the country of origin cohort level, which is about 100 clusters. So
I'm surprised you don't have number of children they already have, and I'm surprised that your time unit is since arrival rather than since the last birth.
That's a good point. We will do something with the number of children they already have a bit later.
Sorry if I missed this, but are these women generally married? Or are they coming as a family? Or
that's one of the limitations that I will talk later about. Okay. But basically, if we just pool the women that we have from these 5 countries, and we estimate the birth rate in the years around their arrival, here marking the year of arrival with the controls I just explained. So basically, before they migrate, we see a very stable birth rate in each period. Then in the year following their arrival, there's this spike of birth events rising from about 15% to 20%, which however is very short-lived and declines again basically to the level of pre-migration, and even seems to decline a bit further with more years spent in Germany. So this is pooled all the women controlling for country effects age cohort.
What's your interpretation of the spike year 1?
I would discuss this later, but we can also talk about it now. So one concern could, of course, be some kind of coding issue, which we do not find support for. Another point could, of course, be there was selection into migration by pregnant women who wanted to give birth and relocate their families to a safer destination, even though, of course, migrating during pregnancy is a big risk. Could also be now they are basically receiving the safe status in a safe country. Now, basically, this is the right time for fertility, for having children. could also be for some, maybe having little children increases your chances of stay, because the chances of being rejected or deported decline with little children.
What surprises me, I guess, is that the 0 year is not low.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the classical story about migrant fertility and shifting births is people don't have the babies when they're moving. And then, like you say, when they get settled, they kind of make up for things. So I don't know if the spike in year 1 is typical, but I believe it's preceded by a dip beforehand.
Do you know enough about the exact date when they arrived and the date of the birth in order to know if they were pregnant when they were traveling?
Unfortunately not. It's very year-based. We actually have the months of birth, assuming, of course, they remember them correctly, which might be an issue given that they're very low educated, but we don't know the month of arrival. Maybe there's a way of getting this from the register data, but it would be complicated because Germany.
So some of the birth at year 0 were conceived after arrival, right? I mean, it's
Yes,
close, but yeah.
possible. Yeah, that's. I mean, what speaks against it? They're just basically temporal traits of birth is that we do not see this dip, right? So there's a surplus of birth occurring. There's no deficit, as you said before. Is it driven by a particular country of the 5 countries of origin? We don't see that. So the biggest country, as I said, is Syria. So there we basically see the same pattern as in the food graph I just showed you. Afghanistan, of course, has also quite high pre-migration fertility. We also see a spike. Eritrea, there I must say our sample is really small. It's a quite unique pattern in the sense that pre-migration fertility is really low and then jumps to a very high level, which anecdotally actually fits my observations about migration from the Horn of Africa. Iran starts, of course, with a lower fertility because these are better educated people from a society that already had low fertility. Still, there's a spike, which is short-lived. Iraqi women had declining fertility before migration, and also this short-lived spike. So, you know, from here, basically, it was not driven by a particular country. We can also do it with the level of education that they have on arrival, which basically, I should be precise, it's not the level of education on arrival, it's the level of education when they are first observed by the survey, assuming there hasn't been too much change. So basically what we see before migration makes sense. The tertiary educated have the lowest fertility. The ones with primary education or no education have the highest fertility. But all 3 groups, again, show this spike in the first year after arrival. Some more pronounced than others, but also here quite similar pattern. So now we can do a bit conditioning on the fertility before migration. Here we define an outcome if a woman gives birth at least once after the arrival. And so we're estimating the probability of this occurring conditional on the children these women have when they arrive in Germany. So here we see a probability for childless women of giving birth at least once after arrival is a bit higher than 15%. Why is it not higher? Because here are basically the youngest women. They're aging into the childbearing age after their arrival. The highest rate have the women who already have 1 child on arrival, which makes sense. Most families want to have more than 1 child, so they're continuing their fertility to their desired level. And then the women who already had 2 or more children show a bit declining probability of having another birth after arrival, but actually still quite high, between 20 and 15%, even for the ones who already have 5 children or more on their arrival.
How is exposure of time dealt with here? Is it have a birth in the year immediately after arriving? Is it in the 5 years? And some
In the
people,
within the 5 years.
some people only have 2 years, some people have 5 years, and that's all controlled for, or
Mm,
it seems very small to me that only 30% of women would have a second child in 5 years after they've had their first.
Some of them are already,
Pardon?
some are already older.
But this is
Let's say at least once.
at least once.
At
So
least
there could be multiple ones.
At least one. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
confusing the outcome with the, so they have one child and they could have any number of children.
Yes. Yeah, I need to think about a way how to probably code this outcome more like differentiating the number of children they have, which should be possible.
So I'm sorry, so the 30, the opposite of 30% is 70%. 70% of the women who have one child don't have any more children?
Mhm. Good point.
How? Doesn't sound,
A lot of them may be separated from their partners, Josh.
yeah,
So that would be a pretty decent share of the refugee households.
yeah, so it's like, what is the exposure here?
Mhm.
I guess the same thing with the zeros. 85% of childless women don't have a,
But they're
Child.
still very young, right? So the youngest women in our sample can be 16.
Okay.
So hopefully when they integrate into the educational system and so on, this will delay their childbearing by quite a bit. And of course, the size of groups declines from here to there. So these women with really high fertility are less than 5% of the sample, which is also why this estimate is not really precise. Then we thought, how does this compare to previous immigrants Germany has received? And we can actually do this quite easily with this stuff. So we can go back basically to immigrants from Turkey, from the former Soviet Union, from Poland, from Italy, who arrived between 1967 and 1999. I mean, of course, there's a bit of selection going on because some of them returned to the home countries and so on. But basically the ones who are still in Germany and who are covered by SERP, we can calculate the retrospective fertility in exactly the same way. And what surprised me a bit, there was also this really large spike in the first year of arrival, which is even larger than for the refugees. However, that's in line with what other people, Michaela Kreinfeld, have already found in Germany when looking at in particular Turkish migrants. So of course, Turkish are a big group here in this graph. Of course, the context, how these immigrants arrived in Germany was different. So these were mostly, in particular the Turkish and the Italian ones came as labor migrants. And these were then often the wives, the partners of men who had already immigrated to Germany and then came later basically to settle in Germany as well. That makes sense. We would expect quite high fertility right after their arrival.
Maybe you're going to get to that hypothesis, but does Germany provide birthright citizenship to refugees and children?
That's an interesting topic. In the past, we did not. So basically, up to the year 2000, we had many second generation Turkish kids, teens without citizenship. Then we did a big reform where for the first time we introduced the citizenship rights by birth, which applied to young cohorts at this point. And recently, we actually even reformed this and relaxed this a bit. So a couple of these refugees who came in 2015 should be very close or even already eligible for applying for citizenship. There are some conditions, of course, like, no criminal offense, whatever, speaking German up to a certain level. But basically, these older cohorts did not benefit this from all.
How about the children? I think that's what Will was asking about.
For the children, it's, I mean, right, for Poland, Italy, it doesn't matter because they have EU citizenship now. The former Soviet Union migrants, these were the Aussiedler, you know, the ethnic Germans who lived in the Soviet Union. And by our constitution, they were entitled to German citizenship. So actually they got all the German passport once they arrived. For the Turkish, it was much more difficult to become citizens. Also, the take up of the citizenship was not as high because we still, until recently, I'm not sure if they actually got rid of this. You can only have one nationality. You cannot have dual passports. So they had to give up the Turkish passport.
For the modern, the Syrians.
Yeah.
We have this phenomenon in the United States.
Mhm.
People come in order to have a baby here because the baby's born here.
Mm.
All of a sudden, there's a citizen in the family. Is it similar in Germany today with the modern refugees, or is it different?
Do you think this could be a pull factor? Basically, knowing my child would have basically citizenship of a safe country.
You don't know how long you're going to be there.
Yeah.
If your child gets citizenship, then you may hypothesize that you'll be allowed to stay and get residency yourself.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Of course, you know, it's hard to say what these people were expecting about the future of their home country and their return opportunities. Right now, we are doing surveys on Ukrainian refugees, where many of them still think they will return. If you ask them about the regions of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia, their assessment that they will be able to return was already much lower, and it's decreasing. So possible, yeah, for a stay, if you start to consider like integration, then this could be a quite significant factor. So just as a comparison, how does the fertility of German women in the SERP look like in the same period? Of course, they have no arrival date, but these are basically the years in the sample. It's fairly stable. Birth rate slightly above 5%. There's a bit of COVID decline towards the end. But basically, if you remember the first graph I showed you, the refugee fertility was kind of up here, then made this spike and ended basically between 15 and 10%. So just to sum up, we see this birth rate spike of refugee women in Germany who recently arrived in the first year of arrival. Then we see this decline towards a pre-migration level and maybe a trend towards lower fertility. The spike is not driven by a particular country or by education segment. We also saw the spike with earlier immigrants to Germany who were from completely different ethnic socioeconomic background. This part is very much consistent with this paper by Krankman and Kraft. And the post-arrival probability of giving birth at least once is highest among women with one child on arrival. Makes sense in the sense they're continuing their fertility that they started before migration. So one fact, the birth rates of refugee women in Germany are substantially higher than of the natives or of the German population, at least if you trust SERP. Within this 5-year window that we looked at, this is true both for the pre and arrival periods. It was also the case with the earlier immigrants that I showed you. And yet, even though there's more or less descriptive result, it already has some policy implications because it means having more refugees basically will increase demand for childcare, for school provision in areas where lots of refugees are settling. At least, of course, for this refugee population, in 22, we took in many Ukrainians, where we would not expect a high fertility post-migration because most of the husbands stayed in Ukraine, but many of them were women and children. And this also, at least in the short run, put quite a strain on the availability of public childcare. And just repeating at the short run perspective, what we can do here with a limited sample size. So no full impact, no full picture of the demographic impact and of longer trends yet. So a couple of things you already asked about, we would like to do, but we are somehow limited to do. Of course, we would look much more into what is their legal status, what is their citizenship, what's the status of their partner, of their family members, what are some variables capturing their economic and social integration, how does it interact with their fertility. The problem is the data is very limited in this longitudinal way. So for example, so I said already with example of education. So for example, there's a survey done in 2016 and they will ask about the level of education, but then this is not necessarily asked again in 2017 or ever again. Maybe they do a resampling then in 2018, where you have a different level of education. So you don't know what happened in the period in between. Same is true for the partner status. We are trying to filter this out. What was the location of the partner, if a partner is there? What was the marital status by the time of migration, which still will not be super precise. It will be the time that they first appeared in these surveys, shortly after their arrival, hopefully. My colleagues that I cited before, they've done this in a basically cross-sectional perspective. So how do all these patterns differ by the partner, where they're located, and so on. In this bit dynamic longitudinal perspective, it's much harder to do, unfortunately. We can also do something on male fertility, which could be interesting, because men were in this refugee wave hugely overrepresented relative to women. There are many more single men coming to Germany than women, so their fertility could at some point deviate if they find German partners or if they later find partners from their home country, but also residing in Germany. And we thought about matching the fertility of refugees that we see in Germany with the fertility of women in their countries of origin. For example, matching on the cohort and education level. The problem there is countries like Syria and Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan have not been the best providers of DHS data or mixed data where we would have like this big scale data. So they will be very reliant on our friends in Vienna doing estimates. Maybe that's something we will use at some point. But thanks for your questions already. Looking forward to that.
Great, thank you so much. We have lots of time for questions.
I was wondering the patterns you showed based on the country of origin. Does it vary? I wonder if it varies whether migrants from one country or another come directly to Germany or go to another place first. So, because you have when they arrive in Germany, right? Do you know when they leave the country, their origin country?
Right. That's a good point. So I mean, basically that we would expect a different pattern if they've been stuck in Greece for like
Maybe
5 years or stuck in Turkey for many years, and then just suddenly there's this window of opportunity to go to Germany. And
yeah, and my guess is that would be potentially different for the different origin countries.
Or not everyone continues to Germany,
Or they go from Germany somewhere else. Yeah.
or they stay in the first place where they left the country, like in Greece, for instance, and they don't continue on.
Yeah.
Do we know what's the fertility of refugees in refugee camps in these transition countries?
yes, we should know that because actually there the UN is collecting quite a lot of samples, right? So that's a good point.
Because I think I saw some literature and I was really surprised because I would have expected women in refugee camps to have lower fertility than in their origin country. And actually, I think I read somewhere that they had higher fertility because there were more services, more food for those who were with their partner.
There's also, I mean, you can argue, right? There's less protection, for example. Could be,
It was rising.
could also be less labor supply, less educational opportunities. So and the time for childbearing goes up. But yeah, that's a very interesting question.
So I was confused why status of partner was so difficult. This is a household survey.
Mhm.
You can see, maybe you don't see it every wave, but you have something like whether a person is with a partner or not.
Yes.
Um,
So yes, we can get this once. And then basically, same as education, use this as a fixed factor, assuming this stays the same. But partnerships might be more volatile over time than education. So there's some
So
assumptions.
you're not getting necessarily the effect of being in a partnership contemporaneously, but you're getting the effect of having been in a partnership at the first wave. Presumably it will be very predictive. Maybe not, but the other, when I think about these families moving, a big part of it would seem to me whether they're bringing children with them, and also what you're talking about, the context of this. From the point of view of the German daycare system or school system, that Germany doesn't care whether the child was brought with them or born in Germany.
Mhm.
So it's really something about the total number of children of these people, not whether they're born before or after the move for the impact. It's a slightly different question, but if you're interested in what's the impact of the refugees, then it doesn't matter whether the baby was born 6 months before they arrived or 6 months after they arrived. It's still someone to be taken care of.
True, but then the question is for the planning, do we need is there a single cohort basically where we need to top up our schools, right? Or do we need to do long-term planning? Basically these areas will see elevated fertility over a while, which, I mean, ironically, many refugees have been put in East Germany, where fertility has been declining a lot. And many schools have been closing and so on. I think for some colleagues are doing small scale population projections in Germany now for the first time with some actual modeling. I think they're
A methodological question. You're economists, so you like the probate model, but as far as I know, the standard, the literature you're citing is to do some kind of survival analysis, to measure duration since last birth, that sort of thing. Is your choice of the probate model just because that's what's natural for you, or do you see some advantages of not using a survival analysis framework here?
Great question. Just a few days I was exchanging with a demographer I met at PAA. She was just saying, I'm reading this interesting textbook about survival analysis. And I was saying, yeah, it's all the stuff that economists abandoned a little bit. I don't know. I mean, we would always say our simple models, are kind of robust to a lot of things. But of course, as we are going a bit into the demographer's direction with this paper, it's probably a fair point to use.
To me, I suppose you can do a probate type of survival analysis if you want, but it's really the question of exposure and how you're measuring time. And maybe in your case, since everybody arrived essentially at the same time, they're kind of all being censored at the same time, so it doesn't really matter. But the usual advantages of this are you get to estimate people with various, some people are exposed for 1 year, some people exposed for 4 years, and you can include them all in the same analysis. And then the other thing I think would be very interesting would be to look at, say, the time to second child and see how that the migration process. There's kind of two stories here. One is how many babies are being born in Germany. The other is how does migration and seeking asylum determine the individual lives of these immigrants and their fertility. And you can tell both, I think. But with the survival analysis, you could kind of get a sense of if you had your child, your first child before you migrated, that you waited 4 years, whereas if you had your first child after you migrated, you waited 18 months or this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion.
It might help you to figure out what that peak
Yeah.
is, kind of
Yeah.
to decompose it into the different birth orders.
So there I concur, your models are probably a bit more elegant than,
Well, I think you can do it all in this framework. You just have to change the way you're defining it for variance.
Curious to hear more about your concerns with the data in the countries of origin. I think that, just a quick Google search, it looked like Syria had data from the late 2000s, for example. And I don't know if you've looked at it and you just have huge data quality concerns, or you're just worried there's been too many time shocks since 2009. Between then and 2015, I think it's just really interesting to be able to compare the fertility in the country of origin. So I would push you to try to find some of those data.
hey, thanks, we'll do a check again of our sources. I just saw someone at PAA present a poster who's basically doing this analysis for, I think, Mexican migrants in the US, and she was matching that with fertility patterns in Mexico. Basically exactly this.
Iran also has fertility.
Mhm.
I know a few dissertations
Mhm.
at Berkeley on it. I'm sure you're right on Eritrea. They've got a terrible data environment, but at least some of your countries have fertility.
And it's not directly on this talk, but I was curious to know what's the model for Germany to facilitate settlements of the refugees? Is it more like in the US where communities of the same origin are encouraged to provide support and get resources from the government? Or is it more like France where people are spread out throughout the territory to accelerate their integration?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, with this wave with 2015, there was still what we call Königsteiner Schlüssel. It has been used by some papers because it creates kind of a quasi exogenous shock to communities, because there's certain key that is used to calculate how many refugees a community should receive, which is not exactly based on the population. So the immigrant share that the community would receive is then different. So the communities of the same size would receive different numbers of refugees. And this was done at the beginning. Of course, this migration process was also quite chaotic, right? People just came from the southern border, our southern border. But then, of course, the question is, do they stay in their place or do they go to the bigger cities, link up with their communities? Anecdotally, I know of many people who have crisscrossed all of Germany and relocated, which technically should give them problems with the administration, but practically the administration has so many cases to deal with. It's not happening. But it's a good question. Yeah, what is there? If there's any kind of enforcement left. I know with the Ukrainians, this was not really done. So they immediately mostly moved to cities that already had Ukrainian migration and being connected with relatives. Or so there.
Yep. Robert Chung is asking, do you have any information on the spouses of these women? Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it was answered throughout the talk.
For any of the countries that you focused on, the origin countries you focused on today, was there a migration stream before the asylum seekers? Because it seems interesting, the difference between the fertility of those who come for, like, you got it, the idea of labor migration versus asylum, but that's kind of hard because those are also different countries. And so it's hard. So it would be pretty interesting if you could say, look at Syrians who arrived at Germany before they would have received asylum and those who did after. Maybe the samples aren't big enough, but
it was an initial idea because there have been Syrians coming since the start of the civil war.
yeah.
The problem is we are not doing these refugee-specific surveys before, so the number is quite small. But I can check because they should be also appearing on the refugee surveys, just as.
Seems like it would be interesting to understand how those are different.
I'm just afraid the number will be.
Yeah.
regarding the other countries, I mean, Iran always had a steady emigration of mostly highly educated people, right? So this was what the regime, they wanted to get rid of them, basically. Eritrea has been known that young men are leaving there to evade the military draft, which also makes it impossible to send them back, because then it's punishable by death, and then that's the reason why they were granted asylum. Yeah, Afghanistan, of course, has been like ups and downs, condition on the political stability of the country.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andreas. So ends our year program. We are, as always, taking everyone's suggestions for speakers for next year. Send Michelle or me or Dennis or Aisha or all of us your suggestions. Suggestions are often fulfilled, so don't expect us to do an additional filter on them. Don't use yourself as your filters. But we've had a great program this year, and a lot of the presentations that were really good were check them outside. So please suggest your names. We're having the formal demography workshop the first full week of June. If you're not signed up, don't give up all hope. Tell someone that you're interested, and maybe you can kind of sneak in a little bit. This year's theme, actually, special emphasis is migration. So I think there'll be a paper presented on fertility of migrants, but maybe only one, maybe two. One. And anything else happening over the summer that people want?
Is there a way to, did you post online the program for the conference?
It's
No. And you will see related.
Yeah.
You will let us know.
And so I wish everyone a good end of the semester, good summer. May you get many ideas for your PA abstracts, which are due at the end of September.
And if anyone's doing a paper with German data and wants to get feedback by a lot of German speakers who sound exactly like me with their accent, just send me an email and we schedule a call for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thanks for visiting us.